Well, I did promise you yesterday that I would do a little bit of a review with you every day, and we'll go through these 60 terms. And I'm going to do the first 10 today, so it won't take a long time, but it'll be a good review, and you'll get an idea of what we're going to do a week from today at 9:30 a.m. live on YouTube. And I'm going to call out the definition, and you fill in the term. And then when everything is completed, then I'll give you 50 minutes to get it online and back to me. And you'll just email it back to me, and I'll see all these wonderful grades I'm going to get. All right, the very first term I had written was the parasympathetic response. Some of these are in different orders, but by now you've heard all of this, and this will just jiggle your memory a little bit so that everything makes sense. The parasympathetic response. The minute you hear that word parasympathetic, you think relaxed mode. And if you remember correctly, when we did the breakdown of the nervous system, we said we divide it into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Those are the two major divisions for the nervous system. And the central nervous system is brain and cord. The peripheral nervous system is everything outside the brain and cord. And everything outside of the brain and cord can be divided into somatics and autonomics. Somatic neurons are the neurons that you control. Those are the neurons that stimulate your muscles to contract in response to your environment. If you want to pick up a pencil and take some notes, or discuss what you're learning, or walk across the room and sharpen your pencil, those are controllable nerves, controllable neurons stimulating skeletal muscles. The other part of the peripheral nervous system is the autonomics. And the word autonomic means of a will unto itself. That means you don't have control over that. All these wonderful things that are going on in your body, digesting your food, contracting your heart muscle so that you can push blood through the arteries and arterioles, the capillaries, venules, and veins of your body. All of this is going on autonomically. And under the autonomics, we have two divisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Now, the word was the parasympathetic response. Well, you know that the sympathetic response puts your body in the fight or flight mode. And the parasympathetic response is the opposite of that. It puts your body in the relaxed mode. Now, we spend most of our time with a foot in each mode. Right now, you're probably listening carefully. You're relaxed but alert. So you're not sleeping, hopefully, and you're not running from a saber-toothed tiger in the middle of a jungle. So you're a little bit in both worlds. You're alert but relaxed. Now, everything that is parasympathetic has an opposite to it, which is the sympathetic. So in the parasympathetic, when you're in the relaxed mode, then we can take from the top of your head all the way down to your feet and think about all of those responses that your body is undergoing in the relaxed mode, and it's doing it autonomically. Your pupils are constricted. When you're in the fight or flight mode, your pupils are dilated, but they're constricted in the relaxed mode. Your respirations are even. You're not hyperventilating and you're not hypoventilating, but your respirations are controlled and relaxed. In the parasympathetic mode, you're digesting your food. Your esophagus will contract after you swallow food, and it'll take it down into the stomach where food is churned and the digestive enzymes are released that start the breakdown of proteins into amino acids, and then it pushes it on down into the small intestines and then into the large intestines. And yes, in the relaxed mode, you're able to not only digest, but you're able to eliminate too. And that's where they discuss the rest and digest mode. That's the parasympathetic mode. So think of that as what you're doing when you're meditating or right before you fall asleep, when you're completely relaxed. And that will hone that concept home to you. The proprioceptive response was next. Now, a response is a reply, a physical reply. And the proprioceptive response is your ability to know where the parts of your body are in space. Uh, you don't have to open your eyes to know that you're seated and that your ankles are crossed or that your arms are behind your back. You've got thousands of afferent sensory neurons for proprioception in all the muscles in your body, which are constantly feeding into the spinal cord and up through the brain stem and to the parietal lobe, where your body parts are in space and time. That's proprioception. I was always amazed at proprioception. I'm getting a little warm in here. I was always amazed at proprioception because when I first studied this, I had never heard or even thought about that. But of course, we have that ability to know where our body is in space and time. Gustatory. Gustatory, she ate with gusto. Okay, gustatory has to do with sensory afferent neurons on the tongue. You have papilla, which are pretty large structures on the tongue. If you take and rake your tongue over your teeth, you can cause some of these papilla to stand up, or you can smooth them down. And on each one of these papilla are afferent sensory neurons for everything that we're able to taste: sour, bitter, sweet, salty, and we even have a sense for taste buds for fat too. So you can remember that she ate her dinner with gusto. Gustatory cells. Lysozyme. Well, lysozyme is a bactericide that we find in our tears, and it's good because every time we blink, we put a little pressure on the lacrimal glands up in the right and left-hand corner of our eyelid. As we put pressure on them, we secrete tears over the anterior portion of our eye, and in those tears is a bactericide known as lysozyme. We do get conjunctivitis. We can get bacterial conjunctivitis and viral conjunctivitis and allergic conjunctivitis, but a lot of the bacterial and viral conjunctivitis is kept down because of this lysozyme. You also have lysozyme in your saliva too. We'll talk about that in AP2 when we go over the digestive system. But that's lysozyme. Eye tunics. I'm going to mention this. You can look in your textbook at the eye tunics. From the outside going in, we talked about that thick, heavy, fibrous layer, the white part of your eye, which is kind of analogous to the dura mater, which is around the brain and the spinal cord. And that is referred to as the sclera, that white, sturdy sclera. And it keeps the eye tenacious. It would be difficult, and you have to use some force to puncture through that sclera. And so the sclera protects the eye, and the forward projection of the sclera is the cornea, which is the clear portion over the eye. And it's the downward forward projection of that sclera. Underneath the sclera, then you have that heavily darkened area known as the choroid. You've heard about the choroid because we talked about the choroid plexus as part of the pia mater, which is the membrane that hugs the brain. And it is the choroid plexus that extracts from your plasma the constituents of the cerebral spinal fluid. So choroid, when you hear that word choroid, correlate that with area that is heavily inundated with blood vessels. And these blood vessels, which is the second layer from the outside going in, is vitally important for two reasons. The retina, which is the third layer from the outside going in, has the rods and cones, and the choroid coat feeds the rods and cones that are in the retina. That's how they get their nourishment, from that choroid coat. The choroid coat is also very, very dark, so that the inside of the eye is dark, and as light rays pass through the refractive media of your eye, they are angled so that the area of greatest acuity, which is the fovea centralis, picks up on that object, whatever you're looking at. So if we didn't have that wonderful choroid coat, then light would bounce around inside that eye. It wouldn't be aimed right at that fovea centralis, and we wouldn't have a focal point for vision. And then the inside layer is the retina, and the retina is nothing more or less than layers and layers of afferent sensory neurons that are photoreceptors. They pick up on light. Just as the tongue is, the gustatory cells are chemoreceptors, the retina is made up of photoreceptors. The rods are significant for picking up on light reflected off of an object, whereas the cones pick up on color, red, blue, and green. And the rods, we see things in dim light as gray and white, not as color, but it's the rods that give us that ability. And of course, the rods, remember, filled up with that wonderful rhodopsin, which when it fills up the dendrite of the rod, then you can pick up on objects, light that's reflected off of objects. And that's the rods and the cones. The fovea centralis has the greatest concentration of cones, and then the rods are in the peripheral area to that. So those are the three tunics, which just means layers. I did mention the rods and the cones. When we talk about the rods, those are the photoreceptors, again, for light being reflected off of an object. And there is what a chemical known as visual purple that we mentioned was rhodopsin. And when rhodopsin fills up that rod, then the rod can pick up on objects. That's the reason when you walk into a dark theater, you can't see anything at first. And after a few minutes in that darkened theater, then the rod builds up the visual purple, the rhodopsin, and when it completely fills up that rod, then you can see. And you know that those photoreceptors are working for you. You have to have quite a bit more light to pick up on color, and the color is picked up by the cones. I guess they kind of look like an ice cream cone, and instead of rhodopsin, you have another pigment that enables you to see color, and that pigment is idopsin. Okay, pathway of light rays. Well, the eye is constructed so that light reflected off of objects passes through the refractive media. That means they're structures that actually bend the light so the light falls directly on the fovea centralis if you have that 20/20 vision. And it has to pass through a number of things. The first is the cornea, and the cornea we mentioned earlier is a downward projection of the sclera. It passes through the cornea and it is bent. It then passes through a fluid right behind the cornea known as the aqueous humor. From the aqueous humor, it will pass through the pupil, which is just nothing more or less than a hole in that iris, the colored portion of your eye. The light passes through the biconvex disc known as the lens, and then passes through the vitreous humor, which is a thick, heavy, gelatinous-like substance, kind of like cytoplasm and that discussion of cytoplasm, except we've got quite a bit of it. The vitreous humor bends the light, so then it falls hopefully right there on that fovea centralis. So from the outside going back, we have the cornea, the aqueous humor, the pupil, the biconvex lens, the vitreous body, and then to the fovea centralis. Okay. Intrinsic and extrinsic eye muscles. Well, the word intrinsic means within. Extrinsic means without or on the outside of. Now, this is, I wanted to mention this because I did have you study this a little bit on your own. And here is an artist's rendition of the ribbon-like muscles that you see attached to the eyeball. And these ribbon-like muscles, they're flat, striated muscles that you have volition, you have control over them. And they're somatic, so you have control. That way you can elevate and look to the ceiling, and you can depress your eyes. You can look to the right and the left, and then you can cross them in the center. And these flat ribbon-like muscles insert, remember that word, muscles insert the area in which they are to move. So these ribbon-like muscles insert on the sclera, and then you control those ribbon-like muscles to work whatever degree you want that eye to move into. They insert here on the sclera, and they originate back here around the optic nerve on what they refer to as the annular ring. Now, sometimes these muscles some of these little muscles may be a little stronger than an opposing muscle, and you may have an eye that converges a little bit. That's what happens when people have their cross-eyed, or they diverge. This is convergent strabismus when they move towards the center, and when they wall-eyed, that look is divergent. Children that are born with divergent or convergent strabismus, and one or more of these little eye muscles are a little stronger or pull just a little bit more than the other opposing muscles. If a child's born with that, there's a number of remedies, there's a number of modalities that are used to correct it. One of them is just doing exercises with that child. And when I was in college, I babysat for a little girl that had what they called a lazy eye, but she had one eye that when she got tired would move to the right. She would a little bit wall-eyed, because we don't use that word. And she had to do eye exercises in the evening before she went to bed. And so when I had to babysit, I said, well, what do I do? And they said, don't worry. She was 7 or 8 years old. They said, she'll tell you what to do. And so I worked with a ball, the paddle ball, and with a string attached, and she laid on the floor, and I sat on the divan, and she said, now you have to move the the ball back and forth. And so she would follow the ball for so many counts and back to the right and the left horizontally and then around. And they had been working with her for a couple of years on that. And they said that it was doing much, much better than it had before. And later on, I found out that she normalized and didn't have much of a problem at all with it. They can do some surgery, but they try and do the least intrusive first. Well, these are extrinsic muscles of the eye, just on the outside. Of course, we've talked about the orbicularis oculi and the levator palpebrae superioris. Those were muscles that we talked about when we were doing the muscular system, closing the eye, orbicularis oculi, and levator palpebrae superioris, opening the eye. So those you do know. And then, of course, these ribbon-like muscles that enable us to elevate, depress, and actually abduct is convergent strabismus, coming to one point. So that gives you a little idea of what we're talking about when we're talking about extrinsic eye muscles. The intrinsic eye muscles are the iris, the colored portion of your eye, and it's this intrinsic muscle, the iris, that in the sympathetic response, it will pull back and open up that pupil so the pupil is dilated, and that enables more light to go through that pupil and then bend in the vitreous body to the fovea centralis. That's the iris. And the other intrinsic, that means within the eye, the other intrinsic muscle is the ciliary body. And the ciliary body was this little muscle here in which the suspensory ligaments are attached to the envelope that surrounds the biconvex disc. And the ciliary body or ciliary muscle has glandular tissue in it. It secretes the substance that becomes the aqueous humor, and it also has autonomic, not somatic, but autonomic smooth muscle fibers that tug on the suspensory ligaments that are attached to your biconvex disc when you accommodate for near and far vision. So the ciliary body and the iris, those are the two intrinsic muscles that we were talking about when we're talking about intrinsic and extrinsic. Okay, the optic disc. The optic disc is the area at the back of the eye. It is below the fovea centralis. You'll need to look at this in your textbook, at your diagram of the mid-sagittal section through the eye. And you'll see that the optic disc is that area where all the photoreceptors exit. And your rods and cones exit at that point below the fovea centralis, and they all come together to form that heavy, sturdy optic nerve. And where they're exiting into that optic nerve, where the axons are exiting, there are no rods and cones. So that is referred to as the blind spot or the optic disc, because you don't get any eyesight from that area. It's all concentrated on the fovea centralis above. Okay, and pathways of sound waves. And the pathways of sound waves, bring my diagram of the ear back up again. I mentioned to you yesterday that sound travels in the atmosphere, strikes the ear, and then the sound is angled towards or through this auditory canal. It passes through the canal. It is concentrated or funneled and strikes the tympanic membrane at the terminal end of the auditory canal. The tympanic membrane vibrates. When it does, it moves the three little ossicles or the bones in the middle ear, this being the outer ear, the malleus, incus, and stapes. They move, and when they do, the last little bone, the stapes, which looks like the stirrup on a saddle, it moves the oval window. The oval window is where the stirrup is attached to a membrane, which puts pressure or moves against a fluid in the vestibule, and it will also go through the cochlea as well. And what it does is it moves the fluid we know as the perilymph, which is outside the membranous labyrinth. And in turn, the membranous labyrinth has fluid within, known as the endolymph. And the endolymph then moves over the hair-like structures that we refer to as the cilia on the organs of Corti. Over those organs of Corti, in that cochlea, is the cochlear branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve, which takes the message to the brain. Now remember, it goes through the thalamus and then is routed back to the temporal lobe of the brain so that you have that sound perception. Okay. Well, we just finished 10 terms, and I will do 10 more terms tomorrow. So if you stay up with these, I think that it will give you a substantial review and a way at looking at all this material again and rethinking about it. Spelling will count, so it is important. So when you give me a reply, when you email me next Thursday, make sure you have these terms spelled correctly, okay? And that's all we're going to stream for today. I think we did this in almost 28 seconds. So thank you, and I'll see you again tomorrow, and we'll do the next 10 words or concepts. Have a good evening and stay safe.